Good to see you all here for a night of nerdery. And you know what? It's going to be a good time. Here's how the night's going to kind of break down, which is into two parts. The first one being kind of a presentation of information and some of the math behind the stuff that we've been talking about and the science behind some of the assertions we've been making the past couple of weeks. And then we're going to pivot halfway through. We'll have a little time of light refreshments, which will be fun. I don't know what that means, but it'll be great. And then the second half, we're going to do live Q&A. So the way that the Q&A is going to work to prevent a lot of outliers is if you have a question anytime during the presentation, there's this number, boom. I expect, in my world, when I said boom, it was going to pop up there, but it didn't. But it will be up there. Don't you worry about it. And that number is a number that you can text. Here's one thing we're going to ask, is to put your name next to the number that you, or put your name in that text so we can know who you are. That is for really the only reason being that I want to be able to dialogue about certain questions. And a lot of the times over text, it's really hard to understand with clarity what the question actually is. And so you'll put your name, and then at the break, Sarah Powers, who's our communication director, is going to kind of rifle through those. And then the second half is going to be breaking them down and saying, oh, hey, Bill, it says you got a question about this. Do you want to ask it? And then we'll be able to dialogue with that. So any point if you have questions, you can text that number. It's there. You just got to wait for it. There's a little evidence for it, but it'll show up. Don't you worry. So anything that's confusing, which I'm sure there will be some confusing stuff, not because for any other reason other than sometimes I am confusing. So we'll jump into it, and then we'll be going back over 3 of the arguments and kind of going a little bit deeper and then presenting a new one, which is called the moral argument for God's existence. So without further ado, I'm going to trust that at some point the number's just going to pop up there. It did it. See? Explain that, atheists. All right, here we go. As we jump into it, I think there's something important to recognize. And the important thing to recognize is it can be really easy, and I think a fairly daunting task, to jump into a conversation like this. Because if you know my history, I'm not a scientist. I'm not a physicist. I am not a biologist. I can read. So I can read scholarly journal articles revolving around all of those things. But when it comes down to it, really anyone who enters this sphere is doing so as an expert in one field and as a layman in almost every other field. So a lot of the times what people will do is make an argument from authority and say, you can't know these things because you don't have X and Y degree. And I generally speaking in this conversation occupy an infinitesimal portion of the conversation, which is theology, okay, theology proper. So I recognize and I see all of those things. I think that's a really easy scapegoat into discrediting the information that's presented because someone hasn't gone to school and gotten certain letters behind or before their name to make a case for it. I really want us to wrestle with the argument themselves. And so I know some of you sitting here are skeptics. Some of you sitting here are lifelong believers. Some of you are just nerds, and anytime you can talk nerdery, we talk nerdery. That's going to be great. I'm not going to present the idea, nor would I ever have the hubris to say that I can prove to you that God exists. I know that it applies in the realm of metaphysics. It's not something, it's beyond the scope of what is empirically provable. But my contention in this conversation is this: as someone who grew up as a great skeptic and doubter and atheist, to then recognize that I believe that the God hypothesis is a better explanation of the universe that we see and observe, not just the physical universe, but the ideas of justice and love and design and complexity and everything all rolled into one. And so the postulation is this, and I'm okay being wrong, but I believe that the evidence, as far as I'm concerned, is overwhelmingly positive in favor of there being a God that oversees everything. I can't prove to you through that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. I can't prove to you that because of that, therefore the Bible is true, which is why we're having another forum next week to answer those questions specifically. Is the Bible God's inspired word? Is there reason to believe that we're holding the same book that was written? That will be next week's endeavor. And so tonight is just having the conversation. Is it intellectually responsible? Is there great evidence to believe in God in 2024? Typically what happens is as soon as you bring up the God debate, what you'll recognize, what I've recognized over the years in entering into this is I think we make a mistake also in categories when we say that Christianity or deism or theism is a faith-based endeavor, and the proponents of such defend it vehemently, and that science, again, is a rational-based endeavor. What I have found, as you start to poke and prod the tenets of atheism, you don't find a passive kind of humble scientific approach to let's let the best explanation win. You will quickly find vitriol. You will quickly find being bullied. You will quickly find being called psychotic or off base or unscientific. And I think that's what's killed the conversation in 2024. And I think that's what is inspiring in some cases, this newfound rise in theism throughout all these different disciplines, is because as the science comes out and as it improves, the reasonability of the God hypothesis increases. So that is the basis of what we're talking about here, whether you're a believer, whether you're a skeptic, in the way that we ask questions and present information. The one thing I think we can all agree on is this should be done with humility, with a topic this big and a God that great or no God at all, which then therefore science in its beauty and complexity, if we can just have a humble attitude towards all those things, I think we're going to be better off. So we begin. We talked about this the very first week. Apologetics comes from this word, meaning to give a reasonable defense for the beliefs that you have with respect and gentleness. The scriptures, unlike what a lot of people would like to argue, in particular Richard Dawkins, he says that the reason that Christianity in particular is such a plight on modernity and on science is that anyone who believes in God will just use God as a God of the gaps and will fill all questions in science with because God made it that way. Because God did it that way. Because God insisted that it be that way. But when you actually tease apart that argument is almost every brilliant mathematician and scientist of the past few hundred years that has made incredible leaps in the field of science, be it Planck or be it Newton or be it Leibniz. These are Lemaitre, which we'll talk about tonight. These were faithful believers. So rather than being discounting science, they were inspired to do science at a deeper level because while they might have known the agent, they wanted to know the modality. They might have known that God did it, but they wanted to know how. It inspires the heart to seek deeper questions. So if you haven't seen this, we did a sermon on this. It was much longer than it needed to be, so that's why I'm kind of just going through this. The question really is of worldview. Okay, there isn't two sets of information, two sets of data. There's only two sets of conclusions. And a worldview is, as one scientist calls it, the smudge on your glasses. It's the little thing that you see everything else through. It's your presuppositions. It's what you bring into the laboratory a priori, right? I was just watching Lawrence Krauss. He wrote a book called The Universe from Nothing, and he was doing a debate that I was watching the other day. And he said, the commitment of science is that whether you be Christian or not, when you enter a laboratory, you become an atheist. When you go into a laboratory, every man must become an atheist to do science. Then when you leave, you can worship whoever you want to. But in the lab, we are all atheists. So the notion of a worldview is, and this is where I think we make a mistake. When people say that atheism is a non-belief, it's interesting that we say that because what we fail to understand is that atheism is a worldview, even though it's a non-belief in God. Because a negative belief in God, which answers the question, where do we come from? What gives life meaning? What is morality and where are we going? That has to be filled with something. The way that we make the human life livable is those are still answered somehow. So if you don't think that saying there is no God, it doesn't change what you think about where we came from, what gives morality, what gives life meaning, and what we're ending up and where we're going doesn't affect the way that we live as people, I think is a fundamental mistake. That worldview, even though that worldview is seated in the non-belief of God, it accepts in God's place these beliefs that are also unfounded and debased and lead to conclusions through faith as well. So you can't get away as an atheist with going, I don't have to defend my position because it's a non-belief. Belief in God is what we call a properly basic belief. It's a belief that we stipulate as true in order to make everything else make sense. That doesn't prove that God's true, but these properly basic beliefs do not need to be, it's not the burden of proof for the believer to prove that there's a God, as if the atheist has to look at all of creation and everything, and the majority of all cultures, historically speaking. You would be in the minority of every human being if you said, I think that there is no God. It still needs reason behind that. So, and that absence of evidence sometimes I think is frustrating as you're having this conversation. Where do we come from? What gives life meaning? What is the moral basis of your worldview? And what is the future of your worldview? Where are we going? This is the biblical worldview that we're defending. God made man with intrinsic value, knowing Jesus is the incommensurable good purpose of the human experience. God's character is the moral basis of good and evil, and everyone will eventually face judgment and eternal life. In the marketplace of ideas, which worldview is the best explanation for the world that we see and experience? We presented the idea of the conflict hypothesis throughout history, that faith and science are at odds. It's fundamentally flawed and wrong. It's historically inaccurate. Tom Holland in the book Dominion does a great job. He's an atheist, but he does a great job of asking the question, who came up with this hypothesis? Who perpetrated it? Because nothing could be further from the truth. The real conflict is between opposing faith-necessary worldviews. In particular, scientific or scientistic naturalism, methodological naturalism, scientism, not science, scientism. Scientism argues that the world that we see has a physical explanation. Everything that we see and experience can be proven by the methodologies of science. Okay, that's scientism. That's a presupposition. There is nothing supernatural. If we come to the best conclusion and that best conclusion is not inside the physical realm, we need to keep searching because we can't come to a supernatural conclusion. Okay, so that's the argument here. Both of those are faith positions. The four myths of the conversation, two competing ideas, we talked through that. Dr. Paul Davies, people take it for granted that the physical world is ordered and intelligible. Even the most atheistic scientist accepts as an act of faith that the universe is not absurd. There's a rational basis to physical existence, manifested as law-like order in nature, that is at least partly comprehensible to us. So science can proceed only if the scientist adopts an essentially theological worldview. Okay? There's a lot that we have to believe in, even when we're doing science. We walk into the laboratory, and you might call yourself an atheist, but on atheism or on scientism, strictly speaking, a lot of the things that we borrow inside of the laboratory, we're actually stealing from a theological world. We're stealing from a theistic worldview. That there is order and rationale to the universe, that the next moment is going to be like the past moment, that we can trust our senses, that our brain, which on Darwinianism is strictly for survival, can also give us truth. And that truth can lead to conclusions and metaphysical conclusions, and it can create beauty and aesthetic beyond what you can figure out just in the human brain. That your brain isn't actually your decision maker, but that your mind uses your brain like an instrument to come to conclusions. So without that, if you're fatalistic, deterministic, and all you are is DNA, as Richard Dawkins says, the fizzing of the electrons and proton synapses in your brain would force you to come to the conclusions that you came to. So you shouldn't, as Darwin said, really trust your senses if all you are is a creature of survival. Because if all we're trying to do is survive, right? We talked about this, fleeing, fighting. I always get these things messed up, and it's not a good thing. Fleeing, fighting, feeding and reproduction. If that's all we're made for, then to go in a lab and to have this claim that my brain's going to give me truth, that it's going to use reason, it's not going to contradict itself. None of those things are necessary in any kind of an animal kingdom. And so you're assuming that we are truth-seeking entities, that we're using our brain and that our brain's not lying to us, that the instrumentation is the same, that the people, when you start with Planck's constant, or you start with the speed of light coefficient, or you start with the general theory of gravity, as it were, you didn't do that. No one in here has tested the speed of light before. But no one in here would argue that the test, whoever did it, was right. But honestly, someone could have just been like, speed of light is 286,000 miles per second. And we'd all go, great. How are you going to test it? We trust in certain things, and we have good reason to. I'm not saying that we shouldn't, but I'm saying at the end of the day, neither is a strictly empirical endeavor. And this is what Paul Davies is getting at. Rosalind Picard, professor of science at MIT, she's an inventor and scientist. There's a lot of truth that has happened in the past and in the metaphysical world that we can't prove today, like you could something mathematical. And of course, all of our science and our math rests upon axioms and things that we assert through faith. So people who think they can't deal with faith are just deceiving themselves. Dr. Alistair McGrath, he makes this, he talks about the dance that science and faith does. Science is about explaining the world, and religion is about interpreting it. There shouldn't be any conflict. So, the methodological naturalism is an objective and an unbiased endeavor. We looked at this. That's too long. I'll read it because it's kind of fun. Richard Lewontin, I think because this gets to the heart of it. Evolutionary geneticist from Harvard. I hope most of the quotes I'm going to try to give you tonight are from atheists, agnostics, and people who would be against the God hypothesis, as it were. So in quoting these people, I don't mean to insinuate that they are Christians, but I do mean to insinuate that there is an intellectual humility and openness that both parties should have to the fact that we could be wrong. And when you watch someone in science step out of line and question scientism, they get crushed. They get made fun of, they get discounted. And so I think when you can find someone with this level of gravitas and who they are and willing to question the just so assertions, I think it makes a really great case for what we would consider a neutral party in the conversation. So, Harvard evolutionary geneticist Richard Lewontin, our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense, this is the key to the understanding of the struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, because we decided ahead of time, we call that a priori, we decided ahead of time that we weren't going to have God. So if we decide ahead of time there's going to be no God, then guess what kind of tests we run? Godless ones. Guess what kind of instrumentation we use? Only that which leads to godless conclusions. So he's saying we are committed to materialism. Look, it's not that we've seen the methods and institutions of science and it compels us to reject God. No. We begin. We are forced to reject God. So we made up ways of proving God's non-existence that make no sense, but we publish them anyway, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Anthony Flew, the most impressive arguments against for God's existence are those that are supported by recent scientific discoveries. But I have been denounced by my fellow unbelievers for stupidity, betrayal. Isn't that an interesting word? Betrayal. It's like we all, right? This is like when you're on some sort of like mythic quest with your friends and someone decides they're going to go home. And you're like, we were in this together, man. That's an interesting thing to say in the middle of a scientific endeavor. We all committed to this and you betrayed us. When in reality, science should be totally open to this. And we shouldn't be getting rid of people who postulate hypotheses. That's the core of what we do. Betrayal, senility, and everything you can think of, and none of them has ever read a word I've ever written. But I insinuated, what if our methodologies are out of line? What if our conclusions are incorrect? And all of a sudden, I'm dumb, right? Anthony Flew, he was the most prominent atheist of the whole 20th century. He starts questioning his scientific background. He changes and becomes a theist and believes in God. He's rejected then. He goes from being brilliant, There Is No God is one of the best atheistic books written. He then publishes a book called There Is a God because of the impressive arguments that are supported by recent scientific discoveries, okay? Contra the idea that enlightenment in science was going to do away with God, it has only made it more robust. Because when, for example, and I'm not pitching the idea of Darwinism exclusively as, I think you can be a believer in God and still believe in Darwinism. I'm not saying those things. But when Darwin was talking about the complexities of life, they thought that basically a cell was a little bit of jelly. It was this kind of protoplastic goo. And now you can look inside of it and you can watch this like little Who from Whoville world in there where like you've got these things and bacterial flagellum moving around and the ribosomes carrying information and the proteins doing that. And the mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell, all working together. And Darwin started with the assumption that life was kind of simple. And then when you get down to it, you go, oh, this is phenomenally complex, right? Darwin argued against his own theory based on the complexity of the eye. It's in the origin of the species. He said this is one of the greatest things that can be leveraged against it. And all he looked at was the complexity of the eye that he knew. He didn't even know that the eye was made up of all these cells and these cells of amino acids. And these amino acids had chains, and these chains, probability of one amino acid lining up is 1 in 10 to the 44th power. And there are 20 different chains on each of the different proteins that make up 13 for just the bacterial flagellum's tail all at once. He didn't know any of that. And he still went, the eye is pretty complex. So this isn't me proving God. This is me just saying, if we want to have good intellectual discourse, we can't start with the idea that there's crazy faith-based Christians who are like, believe in God or I'm going to stab you in the neck. And then there's scientists who are cold and unfeeling and just look at the facts. I think this is the background to that. So after he publishes a different book called There Is a God, he stipulates, I now believe there is a God. I think the evidence does point to a creative intelligence almost entirely because of Watson and Crick discovered the form of the double helix. They started understanding the genetic code. Francis Collins maps out the human genome. And in a very real way, not an analogous way, in a very real way, the deepest core of who you are is information. The DNA is made up of these different combinations of letters that work together. So you're not just a bit of these things. You have a code underneath everything that tells your body how to create more of you. But it's the same thing as information. Bill Gates once said, if you look at DNA, the complexity and the code, it's like the most phenomenal supercomputer that we've ever created, that level of information. But we've never, ever begun to understand how intricate DNA is. We couldn't do it if our life depended on it, right? On the top of a pinhead, if you put DNA on the top of a pinhead, you can store more information in a DNA molecule that's just the breadth and width of a pinhead than you could in almost every library that we can possibly, like 5,000 petabytes. Do you know what a petabyte is? It's a lot. It's like 1,000 terabytes. You know what a terabyte is? I think like 1,000 gigabytes. What's a gigabyte? No one knows. If you uncoiled one DNA strand of information, uncoiled it, it's all wrapped up perfectly, it's very efficient. If you uncoiled it and you wrote out the letters that is on one strand of DNA code, and you did 12-point font in a book, you would fill up a whole book, 2 books, 3 books. You'd fill up enough books that the books stacked on each other would hit the moon 500 times. Darwin didn't know this. And he was already perplexed at how complex life was. So I think it's just a call to say the best attitude we can have is a shrug of the shoulders going, what in the world is our universe? But we arrive at different conclusions given the same information because at the end of the day, science doesn't tell you anything, scientists do. How do I know that? Because you can find the exact same skull over in different parts of the world and someone says, look, an argument for evolution. And the creationist says, look, an argument for creation, like homologous structures. How many of y'all grew up and in your biology class, someone was like, look, the bat and the horse leg, I'm making up the animals, whale and the bat or whatever it was, their legs look the same or their arms look the same or see, we've got common ancestry. What does the creationist say? Look, if you were a designer and you made a good leg, why would you make a different leg? If legs work, you put that leg on that guy, you put that leg on that guy, you put that leg, right? When Ford makes the internal combustion engine, all those other things, and you start looking at what he did for the assembly line, when he goes to make the second car, he doesn't go, all right, got to start all over. He likes wheels. We're going to use the same kind of wheels. We're going to use the same kind of pistons. We're going to use all these things. So the same argument, depending on which way you look at it, is either an argument for or against evolution. It's either evidence of a common ancestor or it's evidence of a common designer. Science doesn't tell you, it has to be interpreted. So, as Anthony Flew said, Richard Dawkins, he's not very nice. I was reading this thing the other day, and he said, anyone who denies evolution is on par with a Holocaust denier. But when you read it, you just go, that's really dangerous language, right? In a Christian community, if you told someone that if they didn't believe in creationism, that you were the same as a Holocaust denier, I would hope the church would all gather around and go, hey, that's not okay. You can't do, but it's, that kind of vitriol is what kills the conversation. It doesn't help it, right? Aldous Huxley, he's brilliant, but we're not gonna talk about him right now. Thomas Nagel, yeah, he's great too. Modern science has done away with God, much to the contrary. This is not Richard Dawkins. That's Francis Collins. Okay. I became an atheist because as a graduate student studying quantum physics, life seemed to be reducible to second-order differential equations. Mathematics, chemistry, and physics had it all, and I didn't see any need to go beyond that. Then he was charged with mapping out the human genome, was the first one to sequence the whole thing. He wrote a book called The Language of God and became a believing Christian. And he said, I believe God did intend in giving us intelligence to give us the opportunity to investigate and appreciate the wonders of his creation. He is not threatened by our scientific advances, but perhaps excited that we are getting closer to a more profound awe of his nature. Everything can be explained by science. This is fine. You don't care. Okay. This is great. We're going to keep moving. Explanatory scope. Remember the story we told about explanatory scope? Okay? Remember this? When you walk up on a crime scene, you have a lot of things that need explanation, and no one thing is going to do it. If you don't know what this is, you missed a lot in this sermon, okay? But essentially, this is how we do forensic science. Forensic science is different than empirical science. When you stumble across a crime scene or you're thinking about historical things, the argument of what happened at Gettysburg, you can't do that in a laboratory. You can't recreate the battle. You can't reenact the things that took place. You have your best guesses based on the evidence that you do have. And so when we look at the world around us, there's a lot of things that have questions to them. Oh, this is for the moot language thing. Okay, good. In the same way, when you look at the world, it kind of does the same thing. There's this all-encompassing question that we have, and any one answer of the theory of everything, if you will, or the theory of life, or the big hypothesis of life, has to satisfy all of those things, right? It has to make sense of the whole world, not just one small microcosm of it. And so when we look at everything in history, we can't say we were all a cosmic accident, and we're all just matter fizzing, and all you are is a result of blind chance, genetic mutation that moves towards the desire to perpetuate its genes, and also Hitler was a mass-murdering psychopath. Because moral categories like evil, psychotic, wrong, inhumane, we're presupposing something in that is not cogent with the idea of we are all space dust, ultimately speaking. If we're all space dust, we can't also then stand on any kind of moral high ground and go, and the Holocaust was wrong. So it's got to be cogent across that. So any one single explanation has to fit kind of a myriad of different stimuli. That's what we call explanatory scope. So these are the questions that are imposed therein. The God hypothesis argues then that the best explanation for this that we see in our world is God. Taking a few of those things, we said first and foremost, everything that exists has an explanation for its existence. This is Leibniz's contingency argument. Okay, the argument that there is something rather than nothing points to the idea of there being a God. Okay, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. Okay, if the universe has an explanation, that explanation is God. The universe exists, therefore the explanation of the universe's existence is God. That's a bunch of assertion. Okay, so if you're a non-believer, you're sitting here going, you can't just say that. You have to back it up. Okay, so this is the reasoning behind it. This is an airtight argument if we can prove the premises to be true. The conclusion follows properly from the axiomatic phrases. Okay, but our job is then, can we really say that these things are the case? Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, the last universal genius, mathematician, inventor, created calculus and the calculator. Pretty smart dude. Lifelong Christian. He basically has this argument, and it makes sense, that everything we see has one of two explanations for its existence on a very basic level. It's either necessary or it's contingent. Something necessary exists out of nature of its nature. It has to exist. You don't need to make it, but you can't imagine a world where it wouldn't be there. So numbers are a good example of this, right? If no human ever existed, or if nothing ever existed, number sets would still be, even a metaphysical reality, that would still exist. Sets of things, states of being, properties. But what you understand about all of those things that were just mentioned, necessary things, is all of those necessary things can't do anything, right? Numbers can't affect change in the physical world. States of being aren't responsible for cooking dinner at any given night. They're metaphysical ideologies, like the rule of non-contradiction, that A can't both be A and not A at the same time. No one had to invent that. It's a reality that's given by its own nature, but the laws of non-contradiction never did anything. They've never been guilty of murder. They've never created a house. They don't invest in the stock market. It's not a thing. It has no agent properties. It's not personal. It's not effectual. It can't change anything. It's not catalytic. It's metaphysical. So, on the contrary, we have contingent things that might exist, but we could perceive a world in which they didn't exist, and it would still be a world. No one had to, these things don't have to exist by their own nature, okay? Chairs are contingent, I'm contingent, you're contingent, this church is contingent, every house in San Diego is contingent, the dirt below the foundation is contingent, the very universe that we live in is contingent. His argument is, if something like the size of a ball were floating here in the middle of space, right here in the middle of this room, and that required an explanation for its existence, we would ask, where did it come from? Why is it there? What is its meaning? What is its purpose? These are the simple questions we would ask. And while you might never get to the thing's meaning or purpose, to say that thing's always been there, or that thing made itself, or that thing requires no explanation is intellectual laziness. We would all insist, if there was a floating blue orb right here, that it would require an explanation. So just because that floating blue orb, rather than being the size of a basketball, is the very universe itself, it still requires an explanation, because nothing about size takes away its need for an explanation. We call that fallacy the fallacy of the taxi cab. The taxi cab fallacy, imagine you get into a taxi cab of logic, and you say, everything that we see has an explanation. And you get in at First Street. And at First Street, you look out the window, and there's a ball the size of a baseball. And the cabbie says, does that thing need an explanation? You go, of course, it's a floating blue orb. That's weird. How'd that get there? Great, let's go to Second Street. Second Street's the size of a basketball. What do you think made that thing? I don't know, but it requires an explanation. Third Street. The ball got bigger. Oh, shoot, look at how big that ball is. That really requires an explanation. Fourth Street, it's as big as the earth. Holy cow, what brought that huge ball here? Fifth Street, it's as big as the universe. I'm getting out of the cab. It no longer requires an explanation. That's called the taxi cab fallacy. You argue, and then by parity of reasoning, you're brought to the next conclusion, and you jump out of the cab. And you go, yeah, chairs need explanation. The earth needs an explanation. Stars need an explanation. But when you put the whole thing together, it doesn't need an explanation. So if the universe requires an explanation, and the universe, which is full of only contingent things, as it were, in its physical realm, therefore, it's not necessary. Therefore, it has an explanation of its existence. And anything contingent, because it can't make itself, because nothing comes from nothing, and because it's just there, is the argument of the taxi cab. We therefore are looking for an answer, an explanation for the universe's existence that is outside of our universe. Our universe comprises everything that is space, time, material. So we're looking for an explanation for everything in our universe that is spaceless, timeless, immaterial. Would it be intelligent? Yes. Because if it makes subprotons to the 14th to 15th subatomic particles, and if it makes all of this thing that we see, and it all runs properly, which we're talking about with, like, whether it be Darwinism or cosmology or design and teleology, it's phenomenally complicated. So this being must be spaceless, timeless, immaterial, intelligent, powerful enough to create worlds, and personal. We don't mean personal like friends. We mean personal like attributes of personhood, will, desire, thoughts, decision-making capabilities, the attributes of a person. I don't mean physical skin, but what we mean by person is has the attributes of personhood. So if what we're looking for to create the universe must be outside of it, that must be a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, intelligent, personal being. Those are the exact qualities that a book written 3,500 to 5,500 years ago, this is how it describes the God of the Bible. Before anyone knew there was such thing as spacelessness or timelessness or immaterial reality, the Bible talks about God in these very terms. The original necessary, God is necessary because by his nature, he can't not exist. Because if God is a maximally great being, every attribute of God must be maximally great. So can God be a little bit good? No, the idea of God that we have in our heads is that he must be that which nothing else is greater than, as one philosopher put it. Therefore, he can't be good, he must be great. Therefore, he can't be morally upright, he must be morally perfect. Can he only exist in a few places? No, he'd have to exist everywhere. Because we can perceive, if we can think of something better than the attributes of God, that thing would be God, and God would be less than that. So the nature is, if we said God exists, he would exist by the nature of existing is better than not existing, which is also the ontological argument from Anselm. We're not going to get into that, but it's neither here nor there. His nature does require him to exist because he is the uncaused cause. He is the eternal uncaused mover. His nature makes him a necessary being. So, what about the beginning of the universe? Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. This is prima facie, really, in the community of science. This is the one that they argue about now more than anything, okay? So, Stephen Hawking, a point of creation would be a place where science broke down. One would have to appeal to religion and the hand of God. If you read A Brief History of Time, Stephen Hawking talks about God all the time. He was, for sure, I'm not even going to kind of try to argue that he was a theist. There's points where you go, that's deism in a nutshell is what you just said, but I'm not going to make that argument because I think much more could be said about the fact that if he did anything, he vacillated his whole life. But he talks about God all the time. Well, I'll share some of those quotes with you. But one thing I appreciate about Hawking is he had this sense in which he was open, in some cases, to the best explanation. And he's willing to make postulations and have them be proven wrong. And he's willing to go where the evidence leads, even if he argues that while he sees the evidence for it, he's going to arrive at a different conclusion. There was a humility and an honesty to Stephen Hawking. So I am for him. If you've ever read A Brief History of Time, I have read the first 7 pages. So. Because as you read it, you're like, what? Have you ever done that where you're reading a book and then you're like, I zoned out, and you go back and read the page before? That's back. Okay. These are the competing models of the universe. Okay, so a lot of the times people will make an argument, well, the universe, this is the second premise that we're arguing right now, the universe did not begin. The universe has been in a steady state. Okay, this is the eternal universe. Big crunch model, or the oscillating universe, is that yes, our universe is expanding, but it's been doing this throughout its history. Expands and contracts and expands and contracts. And we find ourselves in a very, very improbable expansion right now, but that's all that we see. And at some point, it's going to contract back on itself, and the universe just does this over and over again. We find ourselves in the middle of an expansion right now. So it argues for an infinite past time as well. The not theory, or the nothing theory, that the universe came from nothing. There didn't need to be anything before space, time, and matter because nothing made everything. Okay. The equivocation of the word nothing is one of the most confusing things that you'll read about in theoretical physics. People who make nothing mean something there's a level in which, you've read the Odyssey, and the Cyclops is getting murdered by, what's his name? Odysseus? Ulysses. He's getting his eye poked out. He's getting killed. And the Cyclops asks him what his name is, and he says, I'm nobody. And so as he's getting his eye poked out, the Cyclops is screaming, nobody's killing me, nobody's killing me. So the other Cyclopses go, well, then you should be fine. Then what are you crying about? Then what's the big problem? But that kind of equivocation is kind of what happens here when you get to the nothing hypothesis. The nothing hypothesis, the word nothing, it's the universal antithesis. It means no thing. So when you start giving nothing properties, like there's a phenomenally interesting book by Lawrence Krauss called The Universe from Nothing. I just finished reading it. And in it, he goes for chapters and chapters about everything that nothing is capable of. And to the uninitiated, it's really interesting to hear everything that nothing can do. Except on the most core level, nothing isn't something, it's nothing. Ex nihilo nihil fit. This is the first idea of all of astrophysics, is out of nothing, nothing comes. So when you start giving nothing properties and telling it what it can be, here's the equivocation. The nothing hypothesis stipulates this, that the universe came from quantum vacuum states where the total net energy is zero. And if the total net energy of a quantum vacuum state is zero, because it neither produces nor expounds any kind of energy, we can say that that's nothing. This is a complete equivocation of the idea of nothing. Nothing is not quantum vacuum. And when you ask him and you say, well, if the opposite of everything is quantum vacuum states, then what is nothing? Because I think when most of us hear what's the opposite of something, we would all say nothing. No one, by parity of reasoning, would go, well, net energy quantum vacuum states is what we mean when we say nothing. And so all across the scientific community, I read the book and then I read reviews of the book from other physicists and theoretical physicists, and it's his friends that murder him. They just go after him, and it's really rude, actually. I'm like, you guys, you're on the same team and you're screaming at each other. Albert Davis, he has this whole review in the New York Times about how dumb the book is and how it makes no sense. And when he's corrected on it, Lawrence Krauss pushes back and he says, well, philosophy is a stupid endeavor. And to which all the philosophers say, of course you think that. You don't know how to use it. It's such bunk that you equivocate these things. And the people who actually congratulate him in his work are people like Richard Dawkins, who writes his foreword of his book. But Richard Dawkins is a zoologist. He's not a theoretical physicist. So sometimes when you kind of probe a little bit deeper, you go, did you just try to write a whole book telling me that nothing can do a whole bunch of things? And to the uninitiated, it can seem really convincing until you put him on a stage, like there's a debate that he does where Lawrence Krauss goes for 20 minutes about talking about nothing. And then the fellow atheist physicist sitting next to him goes, that was the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And so there is, in some cases, just for us to recognize that just because someone uses really big, baroque, flowery language, it doesn't mean that what they're saying is true. He writes a whole book. I read it. It's really interesting. But it's just not true. So then you have, well, it's called the Big Bang. So for those of us in the room that are, you're a creationist, you believe in intelligent design, you believe in all those things, don't be scared of the word Big Bang, okay? The word Big Bang it's a term that's coined by Fred Hoyle, making fun of a Catholic priest named George Lemaitre. George Lemaitre is the first one who kind of stipulates the idea of a model of everything coming from like a singularity or this nuclear hot dense, and then it explodes into everything. So whether you think it was just a particle of infinite nuclear density, or you think that the Big Bang was what happened when God said, let there be light, which would be my contention, that the Big Bang, I have no issue with it whatsoever, because I think that's what would happen if God, without any relevancy or any point of reference, told nothing to become everything. Right? That's kind of, could you imagine nothing obeying God and going, I need you to be everything, right? So don't be afraid of that idea. There's also ways, depending on which way that you lean scientifically, that you could be a 6-day creationist and still believe in an old universe. You could also believe in an old universe and be a creationist. There's a lot of ways, and we can talk about that more in Q&A if anyone's interested in it. But so this is really the test that was run through, and here's the reason that we reject every other scientific theory or every model that is being used right now. And it starts back here in 1850 with entropy, which is the idea that any amount of energy in a system moves towards chaos. The total entropy, a really easy way of putting it is that energy over time dissipates. It becomes less and less useful. There's, even when you change something from potential energy into kinetic energy, thermal energy, which is a very useless kind of energy, is expounded. And so the net energy level right there decreases a little bit of useful energy. That might not mean anything to you. Layman's terms, what it means is that the universe only has so much useful energy, right? Heat dissipates and it moves from something. And so as his name is Clausius, right? Rudolf Clausius, I forgot who it was. Yeah, Rudolf Clausius. He looked at a steam engine and he realized that when you get something hot and you get something cold, like a cup of coffee, all of the particles that are heated up, they move out from the center. They try to, it'll just start to become cold. No one has an infinitely hot coffee cup, nor do you have a cold coffee cup sitting in a cold environment and it starts to heat itself up. This is against the idea of the second law of thermodynamics, right? This is this law of entropy. So these are all the building blocks of the modern model of the Big Bang. Then in 1912, you had this guy named Slipher who saw that the universe was actually, in the far reaches of our universe, it was expanding faster than it was on the inside, which showed some kind of an explosion originally. In 1917, a smart guy named Albert Einstein created a general theory of relativity, but he used a little thing called the fudge factor. It's a cosmological constant. He was trying to create a steady state universe. He wanted to create an infinite, never moving, static universe, and so he divided by zero in his theory, which you can't do, called it the cosmological constant, and it was this fudge factor he put in to create and to make it be more steady state. Now, he'll later say that was the biggest mistake of my career. In 1927, Georges Lemaitre and Alexander Fredberg, anyway, it's in my notes, but I forgot his name. They were the first ones to kind of capitulate this idea that out of this hot nuclear dense, there's this explosion. Sir Fred Hoyle makes fun of him because he's insinuating a cosmic beginning, calls it the Big Bang Theory, and because he's joking about it, that actually sticks. And as the model continues to grow, even to this day, we still call it the Big Bang Theory. In 1929, a guy named Hubble, using a 100-inch telescope called the Hubble telescope, recognizes this red light shift that, in other words, he sees that galaxies are moving away from one another. And so he's saying that the universe is expanding and it's jumping away from itself at a rate of 68 kilometers per second per megaparsecond. Okay, so the universe has an expansion and it's going fast away from its center. So the red light shift was kind of his discovery, and he really affirmed what Slipher saw in 1912, which continued the theory that the universe is expanding. But what if it's just expanding and it has been contracting and expanding, contracting? In 1978, a guy named Penzias and Wilson, these two guys were trying to find neutral hydrogen in the universe. So they had this really intelligent satellite system, and they were listening out into the universe. And whatever direction they pointed their satellite, they had this and it was bugging them, right? Like imagine if you turn on your TV and you can't hear what's going on in the TV because you just have this So they tried to fix it. They didn't know how to fix this hum. They were picking up something in the universe, and they didn't know what it was. So they thought it was pigeons that were nesting on the satellite. So they go, and he writes about his conquest to like get rid of these pigeons, and he's like, and there was this white material on it, anyway, which was poop. But so he goes and like he fixes it and gets all the filth off it, and then he points up, and it's and everywhere he points, he has this. Well, they actually go and they find out that the hum that they're hearing is the cosmic afterglow of the Big Bang. There's still heat left over, observable heat left over in the universe from the original explosion that took place billions of years ago. So they have heat signatures. Well, any good theory doesn't just have explanatory scope, it has explanatory power, which means if you know that then there was a Big Bang, you would guess that in order for planets and solar systems and everything and stars to form, there should be variations and different angles of heat in the universe, and you should be able to measure those. So based on this theory, the only way there would be these different changes in microscopic levels of temperature is if there was this original expansion, if we were part of original expansion. So they send up a satellite called the COBE satellite. The COBE satellite takes place here in 1989. And what they find out is that the intricacy of the heat signatures that were just right for our universe to exist are to the parts of 1 in 100,000. So not only are there these heat signatures and these fluctuations in the temperature, but it's set perfectly for the world that we can see. In 2003, expanding on all of these things, these three guys, Board, Vlanken, and Guth, came up with a theorem. And the theorem stipulates this, that any universe that is on average expanding, right, that's in an inflation period, had a point in the definite past at which that universe began. Okay? So their theorem doesn't just apply to our universe, it would apply to any inflationary universe, that there was a moment at which that universe began. Okay? So I'll go to this before I move forward. So in 2012, at Stephen Hawking's 70th birthday party, which I'm sure was a real jam session, he actually couldn't attend because he was sick at the time, and he's brilliant, but wasn't able to make his 70th birthday party. So what they do is they hire all these astrophysicists and these cosmologists and these theoretical physicists and they do what's called a State of the Universe, sorry. And so they basically hire these guys, Stephen Hawking hires these guys to celebrate his birthday, and his birthday is this forum of brilliant minds to tell us, what do we know about the universe right now? Reminding ourselves that Stephen Hawking himself said a point of creation would represent a place where science broke down. A man named Alexander Vlanken gets up and he says, we have arrived once again at the very sticky discourse of how the universe came to be without the jumpstart of a transcendent creator. When asked, this is, I don't remember if I wrote this down or not, but anyway, he gets up and the videos, I watched the video, it's awesome. He gets up and he's got this thick accent and he says, Stephen Hawking, happy birthday. The question that we're answering today is, did the universe have a beginning? Probably, yes. In fact, we don't have any model where the universe didn't have a beginning, which that's a really crummy way to like celebrate someone's birthday who was kind of predicated on the idea that, you know what I mean? It's a really bad birthday present. But Guth also speaks at this thing, so does Vlanken, and they affirm that there is no working model of an infinite pastime universe. So that's a State of the Universe address in 2012. Which leads to this conclusion. These are all of the advances in the field of cosmology which point to a point of creation. Which means if we go back to that slide from earlier, we have the steady state model, we have the big crunch model, we have the nothing hypothesis. And because of those discoveries of the BVG theorem, the red light shift from Penzias, from the infinite events paradox, which is a philosophical argument we'll get to in a second, the discovery of CMBR, which won the 1978 Nobel Prize, the theory of relativity by Einstein, which is then improved as he goes throughout life, and Clausius's demonstration of entropy, this all brings to one conclusion, which is we're not in an eternal state universe. We are not in a nothing hypothesis, and we are not part of an oscillating or big crunch model, which means the only operational model of the universe we have left that has any evidence to it is a Big Bang or singularity or point of creation model. Now, you might be saying to yourself, what about M theory? What about string theory? What about a chaotic inflationary universe? BVG theorem applies to every one of those models still. It would still be a universe which on average is expanding, could not have an infinite pastime. So you still have to get around that even with those other arguments. So the expansion of the universe, this is Sir Arthur Eddington. He is here with his friends. This is Albert Einstein, and this is Levitz. The expansion of the universe is so preposterous and incredible that I feel almost an indignation that anyone should believe it except me, right? He goes, you can't believe it. I do, but we shouldn't as a community. The beginning seems to present insuperable difficulties unless we agree to look on it as frankly supernatural. The second to last sentence in his book, written with Ellis in 73. So I am in some way satirizing his position because he he commits this, he concedes this earlier in his life. The results we have obtained and support the results we have obtained support the idea that the universe began a finite time ago. He finished his book with Ellis in 1973 and conceded that fact. And this is what I'm talking about. This is in a BBC interview. Here's what he wrote. And this isn't making him a theist. It's just saying this is the kind of honest, humble discourse I think we need to promote all these theories. It is difficult to discuss the beginning of the universe without mentioning the concept of God. My work on the origin of the universe is on the borderline between science and religion, but I try to stay on the scientific side of the border. It is quite possible that God acts in ways that cannot be described by scientific laws. This is the core of theism. It's not arguing that science is going to be able to explain what God is doing in nature. It is saying instead that God has intervened in nature. He chooses to keep static the rules of nature so that he can be observed and understood and his complexity can be part of his character. So, we read about this. It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince unreasonable men. With the proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. This is the thing I was talking about earlier. His birthday party, fun. Fine-tuning, oh man. Okay, so when we start talking about big numbers, it's really difficult to understand what we're talking about, right? Because like if I told you what's 10 to the 6th versus 10 to the 9th, they're just big numbers, right? At some point, they're just too big, okay? So if you have something that's 10 to the 0, it's equal to 1. So if we're doing time measurements and we do seconds and we do distance in millimeters, okay? Well, in millimeters. If you have 10 to the 0 power, that's 1, which will take you 1 second. That equals 1 millimeter, okay? So let's jump up to 10 to the 6th power. How big is 10 to the 6th power? 10 to the 6th power is 1,000,000, okay? Million, okay? So the question then is, how long is 1,000,000 seconds? 1,000,000 seconds is 12 days. How far is 1,000,000 millimeters? 1 kilometer. So here it's like, well, that's not that big of a difference, right? You've got 10 to the 0, 10 to the 6th. But when you start getting in these higher numbers, every time you go up 1 exponent, the number gets, well, yeah, it gets exponentially larger. I know, it's not a joke, but it's a bad one. So if you have, let's say 10 to the 9th power. 10 to the 9th power is what we call a billion. How many seconds or how many days is 1 billion seconds? 31 years. How far is 1 billion millimeters? You could get from San Diego to Salt Lake City. Approximately. 10 to the 12th is 1 trillion. How long would it take for you to satisfy 1 trillion seconds? 30,000 years. We don't got that kind of time. What's 30,000? What is 10 to the 12th power millimeters? It would take you around planet Earth 25 times. Okay? So sometimes I think the danger we can get is thinking that the difference between 10 to the 12th and 10 to the 13th is just 1. But it's not. This level of increase, especially at the higher digits, it's unfathomable. Okay? So when we get into this, that's important for us to recognize. So we talked about these dials. All these dials, this first page is just what's necessary as preconditions in order for there to be a universe at all. What Stephen Hawking said, within 1/1,000,000th of a second from the original Big Bang, everything should have, with every bit of remarkable, infinitesimal, absolutely unfathomable chance, should have all gone instantly. The universe should have never existed. Because the number of things that you need just for the universe to be spatial and ready for planets and intelligent life is these numbers, but then these are just some of the numbers. You actually need 322 of these numbers just for the universe to exist in a way that's ready for planets. Chan, do you have that video ready? So Hugh Ross is an astrophysicist, cosmologist, and he assigns very small odds to just these 322 things. So I'll show you this video really quick. This is on my computer, taking all those things into consideration. And what it is as you look at all these things, you can't just go, oh, that's interesting, that's interesting. You have to multiply all of these improbabilities together to create the ultimate improbability at the end. Whenever you're ready. Oh, okay. Play that beautiful bean footage. Okay, so that's 322 anthropic coincidences. To create a universe like ours, every one of those things would have to happen accidentally. And he assigns remarkably low numbers to these things, right? One of them is like that we are in the spiral arm of a Goldilocks zone of the universe. It's like 1 in 1,000. That's absolutely way too small a number for the improbability of what it should be. But so you got to take these numbers, okay? The force of gravity, if you take a ruler and it spans the entire universe, right? The entire universe, and you pick 1 inch on that ruler to set gravity, that's what gravity is set at. And if you move it 1 inch stronger, if gravity is 1 inch stronger or 1 inch weaker, there's no intelligent life anywhere in the cosmos, anywhere. That's just one figure. That's one factor. That's this. And it's not even the biggest one. The idea of a naturally occurring low entropy universe is 1 in 10 to the 10th power raised to the 123rd power. There's no way of showing this. This is an impossible number to try to show you, right? Like, do I have those cards with me? I do. Okay, this is a brand new deck of playing cards. The probability of shuffling a deck of cards, okay, brand new deck, so they're all the way that they come out of the deck, okay? They're all perfect, okay? Lauren, can you come up here? I need your help. Yeah, come on up here, okay. Okay, anything fishy here? They're all in order? Okay, good. You can really check it, but I didn't do anything to them, okay? So those are all those numbers. Okay, so the odds of shuffling a deck of cards and having them go back to the way that they were in the deck is 1 in 80 ungavajillion numbers. It's a number that I don't even know how to express it. It's 10 to like the 60th power, okay? So I'm going to shuffle these, and I want you to tell me when to stop, okay? It is like a magic trick, okay? Whenever you're ready. I'm a little nervous, so my hands are shaking a little bit. But whenever you're ready, you go ahead and tell me when to stop, okay? Whenever you have it, you're going to tell me. Okay. Did you like my shuffling? Okay. What do you see? Has anything changed? No. It's exactly perfectly as it was before. Huh. We did it. Nice. That's right. You can go sit down. In fact, it is mathematically impossible, because of that number, that anyone in the history of mankind, even if they did this every minute for their life, would ever shuffle a deck and do that. And we did it. It's pretty cool. What do you think, Lauren? What do you mean? Okay, so what are you trying to say? It's not what? The cards are different? No, they're not. They're the same. You want to look at it again? They're all exactly the same. Ace, 2, 3, 4, 5, diamonds, clubs, hearts. It's exactly the same that I gave it to you as. What do you think? Why do you think it's impossible? What are you trying to insinuate? Say it. What do you think happened? You can say it. I cheated. Why? Because when you get odds like that, and you randomly do it, and you recognize how improbable it is, and someone hands you the deck, and it's the exact same, no one in here would go, oh, we did it. This is phenomenal. And the moment you say you cheated, what you're saying is that junk doesn't happen by chance. You're asserting agency. If you are playing a game of poker and you are dealt a royal flush in the first 5 cards that you get, that's 10, jack, queen, king, ace, all the same suit. The odds of that are like 1 in 10 to like the 17th power, something phenomenal of being dealt that right away, okay? I don't know exactly the numbers of it. But if you did, you take a picture of it, you would call your friends, you should probably quit, right? You'd be like, go buy Powerball ticket right then, you're just the luckiest person ever. And if they redealt and you got it 3 more times in a row, and you took everyone's money at the table, would they all go, huh, well, what do you know? No, you would get murdered, right? Everyone would be like, you cheated. Why? Because when chance like that occurs and someone goes, huh, we did it. Everyone goes, no, you didn't. You cheated. That's really all the theist is arguing. The theist just argues when you look at these numbers, which is just the universe to have space to create everything. And this is the odds that a world like ours should exist with all of its intricacies. The odds of that are 1 in 10 to the 166th power. You might think to yourself, well, there's probably life everywhere in the universe. The problem with that, there's only 1 in 10 to the 22nd planets in our universe, which means the odds random chance of one of ours being a life-producing planet, already assuming that this is in place. We've already assumed this is there, which is astronomically infinitesimal number. We then multiply all these by the probability of all of these, and with 10 to the 22nd, the odds of one planet supporting life is 1 in 10 to the 144th power, and we're assuming this is already there. Then we've got the probability of life on a planet. Now we've got complex intelligent life. A self-replicating molecule, the chance of DNA happening by itself, the chance of insulin. And really, these are very kind numbers because we have no biogenesis explanation for anything, anywhere at all. Everything in science assumes that one-time life came from non-life, and we just don't know how it happened. That's the assumption. So you multiply all of these, and I'm just giving you 5. The list of all the things necessary for complex intelligent life goes way beyond this, 122 things. The odds for planet Earth has more than 80 different coefficients. And for this one, it's 322. And each of those must be multiplied by themselves, by each other, by the next set of circumstances, and by the third set of circumstances. So what are the odds of complex intelligent life existing if you give them small, very, very conservative numbers just for complex intelligent life? Is 1 in 10 with 12 zeros behind it. There's just nothing, okay? There's 10 to the 80th atoms in our whole universe. So that number, it's irreconcilable. When I began my career as a cosmologist some 20 years ago, I was a convinced atheist. I never in my wildest dreams imagined that one day I would be writing a book to show that the central claims of Judeo-Christian theology are in fact true, straightforward deductions of the laws of physics as we now understand them. I have been forced into these conclusions by the inexorable logic of my own special branch of physics. So Barrow and Tipperler were the ones who looked at the way everything was and said, the odds of this are mathematically impossible. Francis, I love that Fred Hoyle says, he goes, a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed with everything. That's what you said, right? Why didn't you believe this? Because you believe not a super intellect, but a cheater monkeyed with it. I did. It was a fake shuffle. I wasn't really shuffling. That's a trick that I do on my kids when they think I'm shuffling, but I'm not. Okay? It's a charlatan shuffle. It's not even real. But you knew that. You knew that with odds that were astronomically shorter than the ones we're talking about here. You instinctively went, you cheated. And you can't then look, it's a taxi cab fallacy to pick up a deck of cards, someone must have cheated. Now, what about a number infinitely more improbable? I could see how that could happen by chance. If this is cheating, then this is cheating, then this is cheating. That's all the theist is arguing. Someone cheated. That someone is named God. Okay, that's the argument. We're going to take a little break because we should have done so 9 minutes ago. We have some refreshments, and this is also a good time to leave without hurting my feelings. If you're way bored, this is the time. So we're going to go back in about 5 minutes. The drinks are out there. Sarah, food and drinks are out there if you need it. In the lobby. This is also the time to be sending in your questions. Make sure you write your name on them so we can ask, and then your question after that, and we'll go into some Q&A after this. Okay, so when we started the argument from design, we said that the argument from design actually implies one of three possible explanations. The first is chance, the second is necessity, and the third is design. So what I'm demonstrating here is that theoretical physicists have no reason to believe that that Planck's constant, the cosmological constant, the rate of expansion, the force of gravity, and all those things had to be set that way, which means that those coefficients are independent of the numbers that satisfy them. In other words, our universe had these numbers already existed as needing to be filled prior to anything happening. My whole point is this. It proves that the way that the universe is didn't have to be that way. We can imagine that the gravity could be more powerful. We can imagine that it would be less powerful. There's nothing about gravity's nature that necessitates that it has to be set so perfectly, which is demonstrated here in what Stephen Hawking says. If one considers the possible constants, this is what he talks about in his book with Ellis from earlier, and laws that could have emerged, right? He's using Molinistic language, could have emerged. The odds against a universe that has produced life like ours are immense. And I think there are clearly religious implications whenever you start to discuss the origins of the universe. So he uses that term tongue-in-cheek. I'm not arguing that he was a theist, once again. I think the evidence points against that. But I do think that when he looks at it, he shrugs and kind of says, it doesn't make sense that this should be the way that it is without there being an intervening force. Now, I don't think there was an intervening force, but I don't have a really great way of explaining without one. That's kind of the concession that he's making. So again, this is not a promotion of his theism. Clearly he wasn't, but there is that openness to it. So the moral argument kind of states this, that objective morals and values exist. But if God does not exist, objective moral values and duties would not exist. Therefore, God exists. So this is the argument from the idea that there are things in categories like right and wrong, good and evil, that exist independent of what humans think or what cultures create or whatever it is. Objective is the opposite of subjective. If we argue as a species that things are objectively wrong, whether you vote for them or against them, right? Like the Holocaust. Was the Holocaust right or wrong? If you say the Holocaust was wrong, you have to base that idea in something, and almost everything that we argue without God kind of starts to fall apart, right? Because if you say that morality is socially constructed, the problem with that is everyone in the Nazi society thought that killing Jews was okay. Or what if Hitler won and he conquered the world and everyone learned German and there was no one with any kind of disability or anyone that was gay, anyone that was of a different race or nationality or Jewish? We always kill them all, always. Would genocide then be wrong? If he's the conquering party and he sets the standards, can we really say that genocide is objectively wrong? Or because our culture voted against it, it's just unfashionable, right? Like wearing a Canadian tuxedo, like a jean jacket and jeans. Is it unfashionable or is it objectively wrong? And if we're not willing to say that there is a divine law and lawgiver, then the things that we say that are right and wrong, good and evil without God, all we're saying is that I don't agree with them or it's not my favorite thing, but ultimately morality is just an illusion. So that's kind of the moral argument. We can get into that more, but I want to be able to jump into Q&A to make sure we had enough time for that. And you can ask questions relevant to that one. Also, if you'd like to, I'll make just these couple of points. We're not arguing in the moral argument that Christians are the only ones who know what's right and wrong. Okay? The Old Testament says that God writes the law on the hearts of mankind. Epistemology is the study of what do humans typically think is right and wrong. That's not the argument. The argument is on ontology. Is there a basis outside of God that would tell us on an atheistic worldview why molesting a child, antebellum slavery, forced rape, is objectively wrong? Without God, all of those things, it creates a category error to say they're wrong because all you're really saying is, that's not my favorite, I don't enjoy it. But you're not really explaining why they're objectively wrong, just subjectively wrong. And with that being the case, we can imagine cultures or a different system of evolution that said that those bad things were actually okay. So we're not saying that taking someone's freedom is wrong in an absolute sense, but just that we as Americans decided, after a long time of deciding against it, that we should stop doing this. But was slavery wrong without God? No. It wasn't objectively wrong. It was just wrong because we voted we should probably stop this now, okay? And on that argument, if we never voted that we should stop it, and there was no Civil War, and there was no Emancipation Proclamation, then slavery would never have been, nor would it ever be, objectively wrong. The argument is, if we're willing to call things always wrong or always right, or creating shoulds and should nots, right? Moral duties, you need God in order to do that. That's how the argument plays itself out. So, any adequate moral system must account for these things: a transcendent standard, a law above the law. Secondly is free will, right? Clarence Darrow, he argues for, his name's Dickie Loeb, and he goes and he just murders these two guys, I think it's in Kentucky. And when Clarence Darrow was making his argument, he said, can we really blame Dickie Loeb? He's just a product of millions and millions of outside constructs that have made him to be a murderer. So don't put him in jail. He's doing what his DNA forced him to do. So we need to account for free will. I think I talked about this before, but a woman named Melissa Drexler goes to her senior prom in New York, I think it was. She gives birth to a baby while she's there. After finding out recently that she was pregnant, she doesn't want to keep the baby, so she goes into the bathroom. She ties the umbilical cord around the baby's head, strangles him to death, throws him in the garbage can, and then goes back out and finishes dancing. And as this conversation comes up, these atheist moralistic thinkers come forward, like Steven Pinker, and he says, so? He calls atheists to be consistent. He says, look, if we really think we're just evolved primates, if we really think that all we are is matter in motion, if we really think the fatalistic, deterministic that Dawkins talks about in his book, The God Delusion, he says, at the end of the day, there is no good or evil, right or wrong, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. We all just dance to its music. So on that worldview, she was predicated to do those things because that's what her brain fizz told her to do. So she wasn't wrong. And in the animal kingdom, do we see moms killing their young sometimes? Yeah. Do we see fathers killing their young sometimes to advantage themselves? Yes. So unless we participate in some kind of cosmic speciesism, Pinker says, and we think that humans are better than our ancestors, which you need to make an argument for that, and because we're conscious or because we're intelligent, has no bearing on the idea of morality, why would we say that what she did was wrong when in the hippo kingdom, if a male hippo goes and murders all of its own young because it thought it was going to come and supersede it, we go, nature taking its course, right? When the great white shark forcibly copulates with another great white shark, we don't call it rape, we don't put them on trial, we don't even try to stop it. We videotape it, right? And we go, this is the circle of life. And when you jump then into humans, not only would that be so remarkably inappropriate, but if you saw that taking place and you didn't intervene, our justice system would impose on you a moral duty. In fact, you should have stopped it if you could. That idea of should have, need to, you are compelled to, we're all appealing to something bigger than ourselves, bigger than our voting system. If I took you over to a foreign country, and in their country, if you had blonde hair, they boiled you in tar, and you went over with your sister who had blonde hair, pretending that you loved your sister very, very much, and you were a guy, and you had dark hair, and the culture went, hey, today's sacrifice, and they grabbed your sister and threw her in a pot, what would you say? You can't do that. You can't. Without God in the picture, every appeal you're making It's socially constructed. Well, they voted that it's okay. Well, it's not what I wanted. Well, it's what they all wanted. Well, it's whatever promotes the most amount of human flourishing. Well, they all seem to be flourishing, and only one girl's drowning in oil. So the most amount of people are really happy about this, and the least amount don't really care. The appeal that we would make to say that this is objectively wrong has to be based in something outside of the circumstance that we find ourselves in. To which if I asked you the question, if right now you could push a button and end Sharia law in Saudi Arabia or in some country that is underneath a totalitarian government under Sharia law, would you push it? I would. But the theistic worldview has tools for being able to discuss why it would be appropriate for me to do that. Namely, because whoever is underneath the imposition of Sharia law, whether it be people who are attracted to the same gender being thrown off cliffs, or people having their hands cut off because they're trying to feed their family, or women being implicated because they show their ankles and being killed for whatever, I can tell you why, in a very cogent worldview, I would push that button. Because each of those people are made in the image of God, even if the society around them boasts that what they're doing is unfashionable. I would say that people have a right to their own freedom because that's been imposed on us by God. God has given us free will. God is a God of free will. So we, carrying out his desire, is where we find, this is the Euthyphro dilemma. This is what people argue all the time as atheists. Well, does God see good things and call them good? Or does God say that good things are good and therefore we think that they're good? It's a false dilemma because at the end of the day, it doesn't insist on a third category, which is for the Christian, what is right and wrong is what is the character of God. It's not what he says. It's not what he thinks. It's not what he asserts. It's not what he names and claims. It's not what he categorizes. It's who he is. Why is murder wrong? Because God says it is? No, because God's a God of life. Why is stealing wrong? Because our God's a God of generosity. Why is lying wrong? Because God's a God of truth. He doesn't have to create a system. The system is an extension of his very own nature. That's what upholds, and that's why when you watch the great emancipators making their proclamations, they appeal to the only thing that makes any sense, that people should be treated as equals. Why? Because of who made them. They don't say people should not be slaves because people don't like it very much. They don't say people shouldn't be slaves because a group of us got together and voted, or the argument was this: God made all of mankind in his image. You are enslaving an image bearer who is meant to have free will. That is why that behavior and that practice is wrong, objectively wrong, because God is our standard for morality. That's a cogent worldview. You don't have to believe in God, but theism is necessary if you want to have a cogent, superseding, ultimate, authoritative, objective morality. Without that, everything else falls into some kind of category of either subjective moral reasoning or cultural relativity or the argument of monkeys and apes, and because they were cooperative, our morality is cooperative. But you haven't actually established why anyone ought to do what your monkey tribe says you should do. You're not actually implicating what someone else wants to do. The argument is put succinctly if you're talking about cooperation. On 9/11, the people who flew Muhammad Atta, who flew the plane into the World Trade Center, was he a hero or a villain? It totally depends on what seat you're sitting on what happened. So on a strictly subjective or cultural viewpoint, you're either saying that he was a hero or a villain, and when it gets down to it, if you argue he was a villain and they argue they're a hero, what do? You fight? The tallest person's right? The winner of the fight is right? The one where most people vote is right? What's the basis? What is your basis? And the argument that utilitarianism argues is whatever is best for the most amount of people is what is right, and whatever isn't or inflicts pain is what's wrong. The problem is that falls apart really, really, really quickly when you just start asking questions like, okay, imagine a world where there's one person who's 100% happy. And in world 2, there's 2 people who are 99% happy. Is it better to have a world with one person at 100% happiness or 2 people at 99%? What do you think? I think 2 at 99, because I think generally speaking, the majority of the universe would say it's better that they exist than don't exist. Which means when you follow that line and that pattern continued into absurdum, what you'll find is there's actually a point where you have an infinitely dense universe of everyone whose life is just livable. So when you say whatever's the best for the most amount of people, and someone sitting in a waiting room, and killing them is going to bring pleasure and life to another 8 people because you can take their heart and their brain and their irises and their everything else. Should you kill that person? Utilitarianism would have a really hard time saying no. Well, that's really dangerous because on a strictly utilitarian view, of course, I don't want to experience pain, but if that means 8 other people can experience a longevity of life, why would we say the infliction of pain is more of a problem than the pleasure of life is good? Now you're making all sorts of category assertions with no basis. You're just asserting as someone stomping their feet. It's just so. On theism, we have a rational moral basis by which we can claim that things are objectively right and wrong because it flows out of the character of God. It's not built on any subjectivity. It's not built on anyone's voting system. It's not built on popular arguments. It's the character of God flowing out. So, with that, we're going to jump into some of these questions. Michael says, but Big Bang does not begin with nothing, as you indicated, but with an unimaginably dense bit of stuff, hydrogen, I think. This does not keep alive the possibility of an oscillating universe, ? We might still ask the cosmological question of why it exists, but cannot that be applied to God? Why does God exist? Does God know why? You have to have a brute fact. If not the cosmos, then God. Good. Where's Michael? That's a great question. Okay, so you want to trim? So the question is, the argument is not that nothing was there, but that this infinitely dense bit of hydrogen was there. The only problem I think with that argument style is that you're doing exactly the tautology that we're talking about, which is to first ask the question, is hydrogen contingent or is it eternal? Hydrogen would have to be a contingent thing. So the only argument you could make to say that hydrogen was the beginning of the universe, that hydrogen would have to then pre-exist itself because when space, time, and matter all was made, hydrogen was part of it. So to make the argument, hydrogen came out of an explosion of hydrogen, the tautology and circular argumentation is in order for hydrogen, which is part of the space-time continuum, to begin, hydrogen needed to be there before. So if hydrogen is there before, it didn't make itself, did it? Because it was always eternal. Which then has to ask the question, what is it about hydrogen that is a necessary entity rather than a contingent one? So the argument from necessity says that God could have created an infinitely dense hydrogen that then expanded, but that hydrogen itself was just pre-existent matter, would go against the very idea that immaterialism was all that there was previously. I don't know if that follows from what you're talking about, if that really answers your question, or...
Well, I think it probably dodges it pretty well, but let me just try it again. We're going on you've talked about the Big Bang, and I ascribe to the Big Bang as well. By the way, I also believe in God, but I'm trying to figure out why one couldn't postulate. You're talking about this world that we now observe. But, yes, we have hydrogen here, but you cannot talk about what it might have, this beginning bit of proto-matter, very dense, whatever it was, hydrogen, we'll say. Why that couldn't be the leftover of a previous eon.
Oh, absolutely not.
With a kind of oscillating type model.
Yeah, so the argument from that is assuming that we're talking about a single expansion of the universe. So that's what all those other arguments lead to the theorem that says, in accordance with Vlanken's theorem, any universe which is on average expanding at a point in which it was. So I think what you're saying is totally right. But then all it does is it abdicates the question back and regresses it back one, which is, yes, our universe, and what you're talking about, could have started with an infinitely dense, but then the one before, there was one point at which there was an infinitely dense hydrogen. So if that's your argument, then I totally agree with exactly what you're saying. But that would argue a chaos inflationary model of all those things, which is obviously nothing that we observe, but yeah, go ahead, if you have another follow-up.
Well, yeah, and I guess I mentioned it in the thing. Even with that, you'd still ask, why does it bother to exist? Why does this infinite, process exist? That seems to be where the answer is God.
Yeah.
I just wanted to, and you talked about God as necessary, but that's like by definition.
Sure.
Right? I mean, it's a little cheaty because it seems like we can ask the same question of God. And if you just say, well, God is necessary being, I could say universe is necessary being. I think I could say that.
Yeah, I think the only argument I would make to that is that the universe would have the very things that the universe is made out of. And when the Bible ascribes that God is a immaterial mind, there's nothing in the character of God that would be broken in the theorem. The universe by its own nature, being made of material, occupying space, and in the Newtonian time, you would be sawing off all your legs by having that argument. None of those things does anything to take away God. Something must have been eternal if everything was originally nothing, then something outside of the somethingness that we see, namely space, time, matter, and energy. The category, it's an inference from the best explanation. It's deductive reasoning. So I think it's cheaty in some sense because it doesn't prove a God. It's just the only argument I think left over. So I for sure hear what you're saying, and I think you're right on track with saying that the idea of it being cheaty. I think the thing I would contend with is saying that the universe and God would have the same level of attributes being contingent. I think I don't agree with that, but everything else is good. Thanks so much. Love it. Great. Follow-up about what are your views on young earth creation versus old earth creation? Okay, so, This is probably in line more with next week, talking about the validity of Scripture. Maybe not, I don't know. I'm what you would call a gap theorist, okay? Fancy word. And I hold this open-handed, right? Even though I was talking about with Michael, I'm okay with being wrong about this. I think the evidence points to this, but it's not like, this isn't an intrinsic doctrinal truth that guides my life, right? Like there is a God, Jesus died on the cross. This is this is my best guess. Is that the difference between Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 and chapter 1, verse 2 is potentially eons of time. The very first word in the Hebrew Bible, in the beginning, right? God created the heavens and the earth. That's the very first sentence. I think what that's doing is it's signifying what happened at the beginning when God made all things. Then the second verse begins with the word now, which is a time marker. Now, the earth was formless and void. Darkness over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. So is it possible that verse 1 is talking about the original expansion of the universe when God constructed everything, and then in verse 2 it's talking about when God actually formed earth into a place ready for people like you and I to exist, where he took the infinite nothingness of space, looked at earth itself and said, this is going to be where I have my special revelation and my special creation? That's that argument. Another argument could be made with how long were Adam and Eve in the garden before they sinned? Maybe. Long enough that when they sinned and they gave birth, there was a city that Cain had to be marked so that he couldn't go to. But nothing in Scripture tells us what happened. So the time, I think what I typically think is God made Adam and Eve, and then Eve was like, let's go eat this out. Let's go eat this fruit. And I don't think the text actually stipulates that has to be the case. So that would be gap theory. I think that helps to make sense of the fact that we see age in our universe, but then it also permits, if you want to believe in some sort of Yom theory about intervals of time, that God could have made the universe, or God could have reformed the earth in 6 days and made everything like that, or he could have, it doesn't matter. A lot of those things are obviously questions, but I hold it really open-handed. My dad's a young earth creationist. I'm a gap theorist. I don't care so much, but I think it's really fascinating. So, good question. Why did God create us as humans in general? Kayla. Where's Kayla? Who's Kayla? If you're in the balcony, it's too far. Why did God create us? Okay, I'll just answer it, I guess. And if there's clarifying, I can clarify. Kayla's not over here? No. The scripture, we talk about the incommensurable good that's found in John chapter 17 when Jesus is praying, and he says that they would know me and the one who has sent me. The Westminster Confession of the Christian Church basically stipulates that God made man to glorify him and to enjoy him forever. And so I think the scriptures kind of tease that out throughout the whole entirety of Scripture. That's kind of the meta-narrative of all of it. If God is not bound by time, then how come God's creation was 6 days? Ellie? Oh, you both have the same question? Or which one's Ellie? Eli? Could be Eli. Are you Ellie? Did you ask that? And your name's Eli. And you asked the same thing? Guys, it's like the deck of cards. There's a fascinating conversation about time and the way that time relates to a God who is immaterial and all those things. And it's the argument is that when God created time, he also became a part of it. So he would have to, in some ways, kenosis himself and have the permission then to enter into the creation that he was making, just in the same way that Jesus took on a material body. And in doing so, instead of God existing in some sort of timeless state, he would then have intervened in time, still able to supersede it. But the idea of it being 6 things, God can still interact with periods of time, endless succession of moments, which we understand. Like in heaven, there's going to be time, right? In the Garden of Eden, there was time, all those things taking place. So what the argument is, and this is crazy philosophical, theoretical, whatever, but it's that God then takes his nature of being timeless, and as he interacts with humanity, and as he interacts with us, and as he creates time, he steps into it and becomes subject to it, but he doesn't become subject to its decay, to its monotony, or any of its limiting factors of time. If you want to watch a really interesting argument about that, there's William Lane Craig and Peter Astor, I think is his name, but they talk about that. It's quite nerdy if you have an hour and a half to watch it, but that would be the argument. How did he create it? How come creation was 6 days? Yeah, he can still interface with it even if he's not subject to it, right? In the same way that Jesus can become human, but then he can take that up again, right? After he comes back from the dead, he walks through walls. He's able to be, supersede those things. So the kenosis of God, I think, enables him to lower himself and then to do the opposite. Who could the Garden of Eden be the Bermuda Triangle? Sure. That's fun. That's awesome. Okay, so I won't have this person answer, but the argument for morality is not that Christians are better than non-Christians because they're moral people. I think that's pretty prima facie, right? Like, there's nothing in the theory or there's nothing in the argument that says that Christians are by any means better than non-Christians, that Christians aren't able to do all the bad things that non-Christians can do, that non-Christians can't do all the moral, quote-unquote, things that Christians can do. That's not the argument at all. The argument is moral ontology. Where does the basis for the ought and the is and the epistemology, where does it all come from and what is its basis? The second part of the question has to do with the argument of, I think we recognize this, which is the argument from the atrocities that Christians have done has no bearing on whether or not God exists, because at the end of the day, what if I just told you that God was a moral monster and all the atrocities, he really enjoyed them? That wouldn't prove that he didn't exist. It might prove that he has a different character than you'd want him to have, but it does not follow from the premises that he therefore wouldn't exist because Christians have done bad things in the name of it. I think what we miss when we have that conversation is the natural progression then of that line of thinking is if a worldview creates atrocity, it must be false. Or if people who ascribe to a worldview go against it to commit atrocity, the original premise or belief, what you're believing in, must be false. The reason that falls apart is 2 or 3-fold. And I don't mean to say this in a cold way, because I'm sure that for a lot of people, right, like I lost my wife to suicide. I've experienced death in my life. My best friend was killed in Afghanistan in 2017, right? Like kids get diseases and you bury people and the world is just kind of messed up. Atheists and Christians can all agree on one thing. Something's broken, right? But to begin with the idea of whatever has the least body count is the truest belief system, or it in some way follows then that a belief system that creates the least amount of bloodshed is the rightest one, atheism's not your game then. In the 20th century alone, the body count on an atheistic worldview propagated by non-believing Marxist communist minds is 50 to 60 times more than the entire rest of all of history that's perpetuated by any sort of believer. There's a book called The Encyclopedia of the Wars, and they came up with this. I want to get the numbers right so I don't mess this up. How could you argue in favor of killing? Okay, so Mao Zedong in China, 58 to 61, then again in 66 to 69, 78 million people murdered. Joseph Stalin, 15 million people murdered. Pol Pot, 1.7. Kim Sung, 1.6 million. Tito, 570. Suharto, 500,000. Ante Pavlik, 359,000. Ho Chi Minh, 200,000. Vladimir Lenin, 30,000 people murdered. Adolf Hitler, 12 million people murdered. And I think the argument that's made a lot of the times is that people try to smuggle Hitler in as a believer or as a Christian. And when you dive into the people that were closest to him, it turns out to be a total farce. Hitler absolutely used the power of the argument of God told me to do what he did. But when you read the biographies of his life and the people who are around him and his support staff and their diaries that they talk about him, he had every intention completely of, after taking over the church, annihilating everyone inside of it. He thought it was completely counter-Darwinistic to be a Christian. And at the core of it, we have to ask ourselves the question, do you really think that Hitler ascribes to a religion in which you worship a Jew? There's just different, okay, that's neither here nor there. The point being, less than 7% of all wars and less than 2% of everyone killed in warfare has any kind of religious background, according to authors Charles Phillips and Alex Axelrod, who wrote a book called The Encyclopedia of Wars, which is not a Christian publication whatsoever. None of that is relevant. It's not relevant. If Christianity killed everyone who's ever died, wouldn't make Jesus not raised from the dead. It would mean that there wasn't a God. So I do understand the problem that has been perpetrated in the name of Christianity. There's good evidence in history that people have used the very text that we're defending in order to implicate people or to hurt them or to do those other things. But that has no bearing on whether or not God's real. It has no bearing on whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. It's an ad hominem argument, and it doesn't follow from the premises if you're saying whoever killed the least amount of people should be the worldview that we follow, especially if then you're going to argue for atheism. Because it wasn't just that. It's Dostoevsky who says if there is no God, everything is permissible. It's the Russian guards who are killing the very people that are in their different concentration camps who said, I thank the God that I don't believe in, that I can do whatever is in my good pleasure to whoever I want to do it to. So it's that idea that there is no moral culpability, there is no final resolution, there is no true thing as justice, there is no idea of right and wrong, is actually a philosophy that flows into some of these heinous crimes. It's the idea that there was going to be no reckoning. So I reject on the basis of the premises. It's a fallacy to make an ad hominem argument because it doesn't make anything true or false. But I think it misses the mark because if you want to contend with the idea of the truest thing is the least amount of bloodshed, you would not follow any kind of atheist manifesto. So does that make atheism false? No, I'm saying that argument should be thrown out. The perpetrators who claim the name of something are not the same thing as the name itself. Okay, they can make right? If you go to Starbucks and it's someone's last day and you order a macchiato and they spit into it 47 times, you would never go, oh, Starbucks coffee is gross, right? You would go, that person's messed up. And you would probably give Starbucks another shot, wouldn't you? Right? But no one would ever go like, you don't want to go to Starbucks. They spit in their drinks, right? That guy did. But that kind of a special pleading, I think, can make a problem when we talk about truth. I get that it hurts, and I get that it's real. I'm not defending things that were done in the name of God to hurt people. They were held accountable. They will be held accountable. Christians ought to be held accountable. And on a theistic worldview, they will meet their maker. And they will need to give an account for why they used the sovereign name of God in order to inflict things that are very anti what God stands for. But on atheism, none of that happens. At the end of the day, everything comes out in the wash. We're all moving towards heat death. Mother Teresa and Hitler were morally the same person. To categorize them by anything and to recognize that when Hitler offed himself over in Germany at the end of the war, he just got away with it. Killed 12 million people and killed himself. He got lucky, right? on theism, he's going to have to meet his maker who was Jewish. So that'll be rough. Dinosaurs. 57 questions on dinosaurs. They're neat. Is that what you're asking? They're neat. Christian application, what's good? Okay, yeah, so this is a question of if there's a creator, how do we know that it's Jesus? That's what we'll be talking about next week. We'll be talking about the Bible as an extension of our argument from theism to why should we be Christians other than some other belief system. So we'll talk about that more next week. As we're kind of in conclusion, I just wanted to make sure that we had this. The hope is that if you're a skeptic or a non-believer, I don't think I probably convinced anyone in here who came in as a non-believer that God exists. I think one thing that I really hope for in these conversations is to create kind of a welcoming middle where people can have these conversations without the historical rhetoric of Christians are psychotic, Christians are insane, Christians are these. At the end of the day, when you look at the teleological argument and the argument from design and those infinitesimal numbers, it would be really unfair for a Christian to look at a non-Christian or a non-believer and say, you believe 1 in 10 to the 50th power is considered mathematically impossible. And with just one of those constants, it so dwarfs that number that for you to believe that makes you psychotic. It makes you brainless. It makes you stupid. That is the kind of thing that's going to continue to make the chasm even further apart. And so what I really hope is that College Ave can be a place where the doubter and the skeptic and the believer alike can come and find community and can come and feel like they're home, that people can disagree with certain things, but that ultimately our job is not that people would believe that there's a God. And this is the question that I wanted to end with, which is the same one that was asked this last weekend in young adults, which is if God is there, why doesn't he just reveal himself to us? And I think that's a question of divine hiddenness. And the question is not, why hasn't God revealed himself in a way that a human being can trust in him? Because that is to say that everyone who believes that there is sufficient, nay copious, nor nay exuberant, or as Francis Collins puts it, or as Tipler puts it, or as Barrow puts it, or as Davies puts it, or as Craig puts it, that it goes beyond a reasonable doubt to believe that there is a God. So the argument is not that there's insufficient evidence for any intellectual person to believe, which is not to say that for you individualistically, you believe there's insufficient evidence for you to believe. I think that's a very culpable worldview to say the kind of things I believe in, they have to check out through this method. There has to be physical evidence. There has to be empirical evidence. There has to be these other things. But in that worldview, I think what we'll come to recognize is that anyone who postulates that idea that the only thing I'm going to believe in are things that can be proven, even that sentence that you just said is an unprovable thing. Should people only believe in what can be proven? If you say yes, then you need to prove that. And if you can't prove that the only things we should believe are provable things, which means there's no empirical data that sentence is actually true, then the worldview actually crushes itself immediately. At College Ave, my hope is, as we enter into this place and as we have these conversations, that we can have some sort of a common ground by which you, if you're interested in things of Jesus or you're interested in Scripture or those other things, that you wouldn't feel other than. But that you as believers who do have these questions and you're skeptical and you're doubtful would find home here at College Ave to recognize that even the guy that leads the church went through a whole season of unbelief and disbelief. And that I still, in dealing with grief and dealing with brokenness and hurt and pain and seasons of doubt is not the antithesis of faith. Hunger leads a man to food and doubt leads a man to truth. And I hope that College Ave is always a place where we're just seeking truth. And so if you're new here, If you're skeptical, if you're doubtful, we welcome you, and we want to have you guys here on the weekend also. There are no blood sacrifices here on the weekend. Nothing really special happens. It's a very similar group of people that are here. I'll be teaching this weekend on the validity of Scripture, which is going to flow into our forum next week to have a live Q&A about the things in the Bible. And if you came in here going, well, what about the contradictions? What about all the atrocities of the Old Testament? What about the issues with authorship that take place? There are really good answers for all of those things. So I want to compel you to continue to seek those things. And I think what you're going to find, my hope that what you're going to find is that the great truth of our reality is not that there's a God, but that God has actually spoken to us and revealed himself through Jesus. And in Jesus is a better life than you could possibly imagine, with a better and more robust explanatory scope for your origin, your meaning, your morality, and your destiny. That's our ultimate hope. Not to make a whole bunch of theists. We want to make a bunch of Christ followers. So hopefully we can see you again this weekend and then again next Thursday night to have that conversation as we talk about the validity of Scripture. So all y'all who have kids can go get them now, or leave them and have a little date, just walk around the property. Just kidding, go get them. And I'll be hanging out here for a little bit, but thank you guys for coming and for the respect and humility. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.